off as contradictions. We are here to play in that realm of contradiction and cognitive dissonance. We are here to infect your mind.
Alrighty. I'm getting all my notes pulled up I found one really good article that I'm excited about. Well, I have a couple articles, but one is really cool.
Well, hit me with it because I kind of deviated a lot from what we talked about during the pre-planning stage.
I will. So this is about ethics, and my board, I'm board certified by the BACB, which is Behavior Analyst Certification Board. And we just changed our ethics code in 2022. So we have a lot of research on ethics, and there was a lot of stuff done in order to create the new ethics code and kind of why we decided to do that. So in 2022, there was an article by Victoria D. Suarez et al. Called Examination of Ethical Decision-Making Models Across Disciplines, Common Elements and Applications to the Field of Behavior Analysis. So what they did was they looked through every ethics code that they could find in a relevant field, including medical field. Nursing was a big one. I think a lot of people look to the nurses ethics code because they have
probably
a
the
lot
most
of
thorough.
them. There's a lot of different types of nurses. Yeah. I think because the most stuff can go wrong, the stakes are a lot higher because none of my clients are going to die because of things that I've done, but if you're a nurse, you could do something very wrong. And the consequences are a lot more than what it would be for psychology for the most part. Obviously, terrible things can happen, but they came up with a decision-making model. So what should you do when you come across an ethical dilemma? What steps should you take? And compared that to what we currently have with the BACB code and what they were writing for the new code and what other people have. And it was just nice to see all of it, all the questions that I had laid out. What are other people doing? What am I doing? Why are we doing it this way? And there's got to have been 1,000 resources. The references page is extensive. It's one of the biggest I've ever seen. It's 6 pages long because they just looked at so many things. So I can go through kind of the highlights, but what did you end up looking at? I'm curious.
So I went down a mild ADHD rabbit hole about the origin and evolution of ethics itself.
Perfect. Because that's one of the oldest, ethics is an old word itself.
Right. I kind of rehashed and looked at very briefly and not with as much care as I should have because I didn't have the light bulb moment until this afternoon.
That's how it works.
Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, both 2,500-year-old documents that have been around and repurposed generation after generation after generation. It's one thing to have a book that's really, really, really old. It's another thing to have a book that's really old that people still go back to for stuff, right?
It's relevant, yeah.
And I also found two primary articles, The Biological Roots of Morality by Francisco J. Ayala. I apologize if I mispronounce any of you guys' names. And then another Evolutionary Ethics from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy by Doris Schroeder from Lancaster University. And that was interesting. It seems to me that and I mean, I kind of waver on this point back and forth. I'll spend a couple weeks in the pragmatist zone, and then I'll spend a couple weeks in the humanist zone. But it seems to me, as far as I can slice it, that most, if not all, ethics and morality derive from pragmatism. That things are good either in and of themselves as a good or by virtue of their consequences, insofar as they align with evolutionary fitness. And I feel that's a bit reductionist, but I don't know if that's because I want to make it more complicated to have a better nuanced answer, or if the humanist part of me is trying to use confirmation bias and create something that's not there. But at the very least, that's how the correspondence theory of truth works. That which most closely aligns with what is the most true, right? And as far as evolutionary ethics and the evolutionary origin of ethics, it seems that our capacity to have ethics has evolved due to our increasing cognitive ability and to cognate abstractly, right? A frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, being able to be aware of actions, and that we can have different courses of actions, and that there are consequences to our actions that affect not just us, but others. But our boundaries and barriers for what is good and not good tend to align with our biological parameters. Do things offer evolutionary benefit and fitness payoffs, or do they not?
I think the drive behind, because ethics gets tied together a lot with lawfulness. I'm not sure what the technical term for laws would be, but just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's ethical. And ethics has been more, to me, currently today, you follow an ethics code to avoid bad PR for your field, and having a bunch of terrible people in your field doing things that get in the news that it's not illegal, but they really shouldn't be doing that. Because kind of the only thing that people in my field get arrested for is insurance fraud, and pretty much nothing else, because they're, we're doing a job. And so financially is a lot of times where the ethics starts to slide, where that's enough for me. But for the most part, it's do no harm and look good for the camera. We don't want people to walk in and go, oh my God, you're torturing these people. This is why we do anesthesia for surgeries now. It would be entirely unethical to do it without it. Oh, well, we ran out, or your insurance doesn't cover it, so I'm just going to cut into you. You just can't do that. So I think it's about looking good and having, obviously not hurting the people, but nobody wants to hurt people. Nobody wants to, gets into their career, drumming their fingers together, looking for what evil things that they can do. Obviously, there's got to be some exceptions to that rule where there are just genuinely oh, I can't wait to go and be a horrible dentist. But for the most part, it just happens because of lapses in judgment, or drugs or alcohol or financial gain. And so I'm not sure how, if we didn't have an ethics code, for me, what that would change about how I'm practicing. But it is nice to have one as something to fall back on and to be able to point to and say no, we're ethical. I follow this. So I feel socially, I guess laws are kind of social as well, but I feel mostly socially, it's really, really important. And as it's evolved, it's become more about having the it's for appearance's sake. Obviously, it's for those other things like doing no harm, but it's tough for me to think about people who would purposely do harm. Like, oh, if there was an ethics code, we would all just go crazy.
Yes. I've got a couple different things in response to that, and I'm trying to figure out which one I want to pursue first. Well, let's go this way. I forget who, but there was a philosopher, no surprise, that made the claim that the distinction between good and evil is arbitrary because even people that are doing evil, right, so not like accidental, we're talking about malicious intent, are chasing a certain good, even if misguided. Right, so at least in their mind, they're doing something positive or productive, whether it's pure instant gratification hedonism or some form of, like Hitler's master plan, where he found a scapegoat to try and, quote unquote, better the course of humanity, right? Even though he was misguided and wrong and murdered a whole bunch of people, which we all agree was wrong morally from his perspective. The ends justified the means, right? So just to put that out there, like, it complicates things when even people that are doing objectively wrong, however it is that we want to define objectively in that sense, are still doing a form of good, at least from their perspective. Another thing about the appearances, I think that is a piece of evidence towards the evolutionary benefit fitness payoff, right? It sounds conceited to a degree when we say, oh, I just followed the North Carolina Teacher Code of Ethics so I can save face. But what we're really saying with that statement is we are following this agreed upon doctrine that's probably informed by reality to maintain an honorable place amongst our social circles.
I think that's a good thing to add, that almost everything that is in the ethics code is there because somebody did that and we had to write down, don't do that. And with like thinking that you're perfectly fine, I think it happens all the time that like I think the thing that makes the news for teachers would be like student sexual relations with teachers. And the teacher always thinks that it's completely, they're equals, they love each other, they're going to get married. Like, it's very rarely them, again, drumming their fingers together, get very excited to go to work and abuse children. They don't view themselves like that. They are, from their perspective, doing something that is perfectly fine. And if it wasn't perfectly fine, they probably wouldn't do it because if they thought this is wrong, if they had that thought, they probably wouldn't do it. So, yeah, it is a little flippant for me to say like, oh, we don't even need them. I do think we need them. But as far as like having, without them, certain people probably would go and do things that would harm people overall. And the rest of society goes, oh, that is not cool anymore. We, the Greeks, I'm pretty sure, all had sexual relations with their pupils whenever they felt like it. We don't do that anymore. And there just comes a point where it turns. And there's a really good analogy in the podcast I was listening today about the last guillotine in France, in all of Europe, actually. and the crowd was very excited about it, and everyone was looking on like, oh no. There's just a point where it turned, and it's like being uncool, where like if you say an old meme or if you use an old slang, there is just a point where everyone is like, that's old, we don't do that anymore. And the same thing happens with lawful and ethical things, where it's perfectly fine and then suddenly it flips and you see someone doing that and you go, oh no. And so I thought that like the memes getting old was a great analogy for that. Like your opinions just change over time, and it happens kind of as a group, and it happens because of that like social judgment of like, no.
Right. And that's one of the things that I found. So Francisco Ayala, from University of California, 1987, Department of Genetics, made two claims or two theses with his paper that the capacity for ethics is a necessary attribute of human nature, right? So by definition, to be human as a taxonomical categorization includes the capacity to be ethical, right? And then the second thing that he points out is the moral norms are products of cultural evolution, not of biological evolution, which I think is what we're describing here as cultural boundaries and the Overton window shifts amongst societies as it naturally does. Those rough barriers and boundaries around what is and isn't an ethical decision shifts as well. And before we get too crazy and say, well, by that definition, all ethics then is just nothing but a social construct, there's a point that he makes that I'm going to lose. But he points out that while the boundaries and definitions of our ethics might be a product of cultural evolution, that cultural evolution still needs to align with our biological evolution, because if it doesn't, then it becomes counterproductive for the evolutionary process, and by definition, then it will get weeded out over time, right? Those ethical norms don't last long if they're not embedded in the biology there. There's something else too that I don't know which way I want to dig in this right now. We also need to talk about altruism as well, because that's a little bit of an outlier here. And I'm sorry to sound kind of scatterbrained, but I found two things in my notes that I was really excited to talk about that I want to talk about really quickly. First things first, let me run this by you. In fact, I think I'm just going to quote him at length because it's really good. Says Francisco Ayala, quote, "The evolutionary roots of this capacity, meaning the ability to establish connection between means and ends, may be found in the evolution of the erect position, which transformed the anterior limbs of our ancestors from organs of locomotion into organs of manipulation. The hands thereby gradually became organs adept for the construction and use of objects for hunting and other activities that improve survival and reproduction, i.e., that increase the reproductive fitness of their carriers. The construction of tools depends not only on manual dexterity, but in perceiving them precisely as tools, as objects that help to perform certain actions, that is, as means that serve certain ends or purposes, a knife for cutting, an arrow for hunting, an animal skin for protecting the body from the cold." Natural selection promoted the intellectual capacity of our biped ancestors because increased intelligence facilitated the perception of tools as tools, and therefore their construction and use, with the ensuing amelioration of biological survival and reproduction. And I thought that was particularly interesting because if we follow the logic of that, by humanoids evolving into a bipedal standing posture, freeing up our hands, coinciding with our brain growth, it is our ability to see things as things, constituent parts, so to speak, and to be able to manipulate them in the real world physically, that became the roots of our ability to have ethical thinking. Because if we have a concept of a means to an end, constituent parts into a whole, then we have a means of tracking behavior A leads to consequence B.
That is like a perfect encapsulation of like evolutionary psychology and why I love it. Like going back to where these came from, like it's in our DNA. If we had a way to explicitly read our DNA, all of these questions we have would be answered pretty much, because nothing that we do is because I guess everything that we do is connected to as a part of the animal kingdom rather than, you know, Adam and Eve, which is my favorite way to think about the world. Because it makes me feel nice and cozy on Earth, knowing like we are on this planet made specifically for this planet, and we would be probably bad everywhere else. I can't think of where I was going with that. Was altruism tied into that, or was that something separate?
No, altruism was just something separate. And that was a point that mathematicians have created mathematical formulas that suggest that altruism does indeed have fitness payoffs for evolutionary game theory. Because we would think that, I mean, if we just take the basic root understanding of Darwin's theory, survival of the fittest, and distill it down to its core element of that which is most fit, survives most, and passes its genes on most. Therefore, that becomes the dominant gene pool, so to speak. Then it's counterintuitive for me to want to make sure that my neighbor has food. Right? It should be, if we take Darwin at face value, it should be A, look out for number one first in all cases, because those are going to be the displays of evolutionary fitness, and hence the survival of that which is most fit. But in fact, what these scientists and mathematicians found was that altruism, meaning assisting others outside of yourself and your immediate family, meaning like moms, dads, and kids, with no intention of trying to benefit yourself, has benefits for the communities, groups, and the species. So there is evolutionary benefit to being altruistic, being good for the sake of, being good for the sake of good. Now we can, I was going to say narrow down, but I think point. I think we can point that much more clearly, at least with extended family groups, right? If we're talking purely about like Richard Dawkins' selfish gene perspective, it is in my interest to help raise my siblings' kids, even if they're not mine, because we all share a portion of the gene pool. Therefore, my specific genes might not continue, but ones that we share will. But as I was to understand it, the altruism piece extends beyond just those selfish gene perspectives.
Right. That kind of unexplainable, like, why do I want this person to thrive? It does nothing for me.
Right. Why
but
do
it does. Yeah.
we as human beings, why do we have a propensity to feel guilt when we see a homeless person in the street, or to feel bad hearing someone get fired, even if they're across the street? We have these physiological responses to these moral triggers that are difficult to explain. Even with the ethics and the academic articles and the code of ethics and all that stuff, to avoid the is-ought problem, just because we can delineate where our propensity and disposition to be ethical comes from, doesn't tell us why. Right? And just because we say that working together gives us evolutionary benefit doesn't, and this may be the not pragmatist in me trying to reach for an answer, but it doesn't feel sufficient as to a why. So to go back to your example earlier, and then I'll let you respond because I know you're itching to say something. That whole do no harm thing is part of like code of ethics, especially for clinicians and physicians. That statement doesn't tell us why. Right? Why should you not do harm? And that's a very tricky question to answer.
And also, like, what specific set of skills and behaviors do you need to do no harm? What does that look like? What is harm? How do you do harm? How do you do no harm? What does that look like? How can you tell? Which is why ethics codes can get really long, because even defining harm can be like, there's a point where you have to draw the line and say that's not harmful enough to count. And that's really tough. Something I was going to say with your, like, why we are ethical and why we all sort of instinctively know being ethical is good goes back to that social pressure and that sort of the meme getting old and everyone going, oh, we don't do that anymore at the same time, with our behaviors and the things that we do as part of our job and the things that we do in society, where the reason that we stop doing those things is because people show you disdain when you do them, and you get fired and you face consequences, and people say, oh, that's bad, you shouldn't do that. Like, like clapping at an execution would be insane today. Like, people would think that you are the worst person ever. And that, people used to get drunk at executions. You
say that. And to the last part, yes, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that late medieval and early modern period execution goers used to tailgate before the executions. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that our boundaries of ethics have really changed that much, because I don't know if you remember, but I remember when Osama bin Laden got.
Mm-hmm.
And like, we as a country celebrated. Right?
That's true, yeah.
Now, a lot of that is probably Now that's celebrated, loosely defined in air quotes around it. That's not like, there were raves and we declared 7 days of feasting like they did in ancient Rome or anything like that. But that could be a phenomenon of groupthink, right? If we scale humanity up to the size of an entire nation, then the collective IQ is only that which is like the lowest, right? That's when people tend to operate in groups, the lowest IQ tends to become the common denominator, right? And on top of that too, being able to vilify somebody and justify those actions as a course of justice in some capacity seems to, I'm not going to say get rid of, but makes the boundaries around ethical behavior a little bit more permeable and malleable.
I think there is a line for all of those. Like there is never a hard and fast rule. Like you shouldn't be happy when someone dies. That's always sad, except when it's that guy. And I think that's the difficulty of deciding what's right and what's wrong, what's ethical and what's unethical, because even like people were happy about bin Laden and felt like, oh, this was a success, this is the end of a chapter. But if you said that at work during a meeting, you would probably be reprimanded. That's inappropriate for work. If you said that at home at the dinner table, not a big deal. So it's always flexible with the environment, with who you are, with who you're around, with what your expectations are. Like we would expect the president to be like, good job, boys. And the expectations for people, but you probably couldn't be excited about it as a teacher, for example. That might be a little bit harsh. That might toe the line. You'd have to look at the ethics code and see like, oh, it was a current event. You could spin it as well, which is why it's very interesting. It's very difficult. It's why ethics codes take years to write and are never truly done. They're just published. So something that the article that I read had the whole point was to figure out what most people are doing when they make an ethical decision. And by people, I mean fields, what their codes of ethics say that they should be doing when they're making a decision. So that would be if you have to choose a treatment, for example, and you're weighing if this treatment is worth the risks or if it is not worth the risks and you shouldn't recommend it, if continue with no treatment is worth the risks, or if you're seeing someone do something questionable and thinking, should I report them? Was that fine? What's going on? And kind of that, what should you do? What steps should you follow to make sure that you're covered, that you've made an ethical decision. So we could go through those, but I don't want to move away from your sort of base of ethics research before we move on to what people are doing today.
Well, and we need, we do need to transition that way, but I think there's one more quick topic that we can discuss, and then I'll either find ways to spackle in what I have, or I'll just use it to inform my responses to yours.
I'll be interested to see how it kind of compares to modern ethics. I'm sure they weren't here this way.
It's going to be interesting to see where they dovetail. But I think this is a good time to bring up Lawrence Kohlberg and his theory of moral development. So for those that might be unfamiliar, Lawrence Kohlberg was an American psychologist, and he developed what he called his theory of cognitive development, which very closely aligned to Piaget's. Kohlberg developed his theory of moral development, which very closely align to Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. And essentially, Kohlberg just said that as our brains get more complicated as we grow up, our ability to make ethical decisions and the way we judge what is right and wrong and just and unjust gets more complicated as well. So the three primary groups of stages, there's the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional moral reasoning. So for example, if I have a 5-year-old at home, there's two primary ways that he or she is going to determine what is just and unjust, what is ethical and not ethical. And that's going to be primarily through seeking reward or avoiding punishment. If I tell my youngest, Orion, that he needs to make his bed, and every time he makes his bed, I give him a sucker, he's going to want to keep wanting to make his bed because he's basing that as the proper action to do because he's seeking that reward, or he gets the attaboy or the hug, or he feels good about himself because he accomplished the task. Alternatively, if I tell him he needs to make his bed because that's the right thing to do, and every time he doesn't, I spank him, then he's going to internalize that I need to be making my bed because it's the right thing to do, because if I don't, then I'm going to receive this sort of punishment, right? So he's going to use either seeking reward or avoiding punishment.
Yeah, same skill, just different motivation.
Right. Right around middle school to high school, we see a change in that thinking, though, or should, where that rationality, whichever one's grammatically correct, take your pick, for enacting behaviors tends to be more, how do I fit in the group, right? For example, I'm a teacher, I act a certain type of way and modify my behavior because we all have a mutual understanding of what a good teacher does and behaves and acts like, and I want to be a good teacher, so I'm going to enact what I think those boundaries are, right? Alternatively, we have that whole, I operate in a friendship circle, and our friendship circle has loosely defined the boundaries for our behavior, and I want to stay a part of that friendship circle and not get excluded, right? So I'm going to modify my behavior that way. It's seeking reward and avoiding punishment, but to the next step, right? Because it's taking in those communal factors as well. And then at some point, most people will hit the 5th stage. Some people hit the 6th stage, the post-conventional moral reasoning, where we start bringing in that idea of social contracts, right? That we as a society have not just arbitrarily decided, but we've used whatever logical and reason-based methods that we have available to loosely bound behavior because it benefits the group. Altruism, if you will. But then you have this sneaky little bugger at the end, universal ethical principle. And the best way that I found to explain it is Rosa Parks and refusing to move on the bus. You reach a stage of moral reasoning where you understand that laws are fallible, rules are fallible, and if a rule or law is unjust, then you are not unjust by breaking that. Right? Thumbs up. So just, I don't know, that's just something fun I like to keep in the back of my head, especially when I'm talking with my philosophy club. So as we go through, like, I like Kohlberg's theory because it's rooted in that pragmatist, but it takes it into that more cognitive behavioral realm. And I tend to be more of a Piagetian or Piagetite, however you would say that. Play around in those complex theories a little bit more.
I think it's nice to have, like, you kind of have to have a big, vague, like, and then you learn to be ethical. Like, And that's really just how it happens, because you don't just memorize a set of rules. You have to apply what you know to each specific situation every single time. And we get better at that, with our schemas and prejudices in the pure psychological terms, prejudices, the things that we already know, and say, like, that was a good thing to do, that was a bad thing to do. A good example is like cop body cam footage. A lot of people have a prejudice that like cops are violent and probably going to hurt people. So when they start watching cop body cam footage, they're looking for the, like, oh, they shouldn't have done that. That was bad. And so they're applying their ethics very quickly to those situations. And someone who is like pro cop or actually a cop or has experiences in those situations would be applying their own ethics and saying, well, he had to because X, Y, Z. And it's not just one thing. It is a very fluid, mentalistic, really annoying thing for especially like behavior analysts to try and tamp down, because we would love to have a very clear operational definition for everything that we do. And being ethical is something that is just such a complex behavior that you just start walking around in circles in your brain, trying to pin down what's the right thing to do. Like moving on the bus for someone who was mean to you and not doing it could be, pride, standing up for yourself, or not moving on the bus or moving on the bus anyways could also be being the bigger person. And you really care about, your impact on the world by being nice to someone who was mean to you. And having like both of those things could be completely right. And you can argue either one. And we usually don't, because nothing really consequential happens from most of the situations. It's just we just move on with our life. And having the way that the like decision-making model puts it is an ethical radar that is, let's see, there was 55 different ethical decision models put into this, and they did statistics on all of those. And they were from like psychiatry, emergency medicine, oncology, dentistry, counseling, psychology, coaching, all of those human services type of roles. And 38% of them reference an ethical radar as being the first step to being ethical. You just have to have a radar and say, that's right, that's wrong, and kind of trust your gut to identify situations that are a problem versus things that you can just kind of let go. So I think ethical radar is a great term for it, because you're just kind of always on the lookout for them. And when it happens, you identify it or you miss it, and, you learn from your mistake. So that's how they all start, is you just know, which is not satisfying.
Well, and I think that's interesting for two reasons. First of all, we go back to the social cues, right? Being able to have a loose yet innate radar, to use their terms, to be able to very quickly and with relative accuracy identify the normies from the deviants, for lack of better terms, right? At least if we're talking bell curve, which leads to it being interesting for the second point. In a sense, we can look at ethics as a heuristic, a resolution lowering device, to where we can compartmentalize this very complex scenario into as few base components as possible to still be probabilistically accurate, with, a tolerance of error in there about passing judgment on that situation, because doing so allows us to more speedily determine in-group preference from out-group discrimination, right? if we're in the mall and I see a group of people acting a certain type of way, my radar is going to ping and it's going to have me keep, social avoidance because I don't want to be associated with, nor do I want to get wrapped up in whatever trouble they might be bringing. And likewise, you go to the park or you go to a baseball game or you go to the mall and you see that group of people that your radar pings and says, hey, they're acting appropriately, right? Then you know that you don't have to be on quite as high alert. You don't have to have that social avoidance that for the immediate, you have a lower chance of getting wrapped up in any sort of trouble or drama or violence that they might partake in because your radar is suggesting that they're not going to partake in that. And B, you don't get the negative social currency ping for being associated with them.
I think on the heuristic side, like the age and what the person looks like go into all of that as well. Because like having, telling someone like, oh, just do that yourself depends on that specific person. Like if we're bringing in groceries and it's a perfectly, or, in my specific role working with people with disabilities, a perfectly capable person who's, they can walk, they can hold grocery bags, telling them like, just do them yourself. Like I'm trying to make you be independent, just do it yourself, and pushing them to do a task that they don't want to do versus a caregiver, the same person, same role, but for someone who's like 82. Be more independent, do it yourself. I really want to push you on this skill. But that's probably unethical because that person's really old and the other person is like a 20-something who, needs to learn that skill. So the everything is dependent on the people involved in the situation. And, like I'm imagining like someone, or it's the same thing, an older person versus a typical, 30-something, like arguing with a like service employee and they're just arguing. If it's just like a 30-year-old talking to another 30-year-old service worker, probably not going to think much of that. But if it's like a very flustered old person, an older adult talking to the service worker and they're arguing about something, that might ping you as like this older person is vulnerable. I should go over and overhear and see what they're talking about. Versus two people who appear, on the same level. There doesn't seem to be some type of power dynamic there. Like, okay, they're just arguing. Who cares?
Well, and I think something else to consider too is, and I might be tiptoeing down the naturalistic fallacy here, but at least the boundaries for what we determine as ethical or not ethical seems to be shaped by, at least from the philosopher's point of view, the end of whatever it is that we're talking about, right? So like philosophical definition of end, meaning the purpose of or the goal or something like that. Right. So like we might choose to interact with people differently because the ends are different. Caregivers dealing with permanently handicapped people aren't trying to have those people. I mean, obviously they're trying to have them be as independent as possible, but also at the same time they recognize that there's a permanent dependence there, and therefore it is their purpose to fill that, to assist them, which changes the boundaries and dynamics of how they make the ethical decisions for relating with that person. Whereas we use the role of a parent as an example. If I'm trying to help my kid be independent because I'm not raising my children to be my peers, I'm raising my children to be my replacements, then it might seem a little harsher compared to the other scenarios, but the boundaries with which I interact with those people, the boundaries with which my ethics of interacting with those people are going to change slightly. And this is something I use with my students all the time to get them to think about moral dilemmas and things like that. As a parent, there is no nice way to discipline your child. Obviously, there's better and worse ways. There's more humane and inhumane. There's more effective and ineffective. But by definition, discipline is introducing a bad to de-incentivize behaviors. There's no nice way to do that. If my kid does something wrong, however it is we want to define wrong, then to de-incentivize that behavior, I introduce this bad. I ground them. I take something away. I restrict access to something. I make them do extra chores or extra work, whatever it is, none of which are in the short term good or beneficial or even enjoyable to the disciplinee. The same way that if I'm a boss and I have employees and one of them is stealing money from me, I need to fire them. There's no nice way to do that. You can be tactful and respect them as a person, or at least respect their base humanity and be like, look, you're no longer invited to work here anymore. I'm sorry that this might have a negative effect on your family, but you've been acting against how we act here, and that's not okay, and here's how I'm demonstrating that, and then you push them out.
It is so funny because in the state of Oregon, I, as a behavior analyst, am strictly banned from using punishment. Absolutely not allowed. I have to, if I see punishment, I have to train against it, which is very funny because, like, on a technical level, punishment is not something you can avoid. Punishment is, if you wait too long to go to the bathroom and you're really rushing and it hurts, that's a punisher. You're not going to do that again that day, probably. Punishment is if someone says, like, yeah, okay, in that tone, that can be a punisher. And on, like, I know what they're talking about when they say I'm not allowed to use punishment, but because, like, punishment is a scientific term and using it in that, like, you can't do that is so funny because it's a part of life. Punishment is just something that happens. It can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. It can look like cutting off someone's hand because they stole something. But if they steal something again, then that technically wasn't a punisher because they didn't stop doing that. That was just a thing that you did to them for no reason, which is why, a lot of, like, the prison systems overall don't work, because if they keep doing the thing that they went to prison for, that obviously wasn't very effective as a punisher. And it gets really, really tough from, like, looking at behavior and what people do as a science and then having, like, politicians and say, like, oh, punishment's bad, you can't do that. And I'm like, okay, wink, wink. But, like, punishment happens every day, all the time. Like, that's the reason why you stop doing things is punishment, no matter what it was. Anything that you've ever stopped doing in your entire life is because of punishment. Even, like, drinking a lot of water. If I just drank from the straw until my stomach hurt, that would be a punisher and I would stop. And it's when you start to get to that, like, technical level, everything in, like, ethics and morals starts to break down, because you can't just blanket statement most things. You can't discipline, you can't punish. Like, yes, you can, you have to. People are going to, and it's important that we study those things and know what they are and know what their actual effects are on behavior, so that way we can use them in an ethical way versus not knowing what they are, avoiding them altogether, and just shielding our eyes and pretending, see no evil, pretending that punishment doesn't happen in the state of Oregon because they said so.
Which is why I very much like Aristotle's ethics. And I don't just mean that in, like, the first principles branch of philosophy. I'm not talking his comprehensive philosophical ideas here. I'm specifically referencing his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, which is Aristotle's book, The Ethics. Pretty sure it's written down by his son Nicomacheus or I don't know. I don't remember all the ancient Greek for it, because there's a couple different versions of it. But the point I'm trying to make is that all ethics seem to be tailored towards a good. You might even call it the good, right? And so, for example, or at least to stick with the punishment theme for now, what happens? Let me take a step back. This morality can be present even without other people around, right? It's not merely an emergent property of a society type of thing, right? Here's what I mean by that, or here's my thought process behind that. Even a hermit alone in the woods for the duration of his or her life has to operate underneath some kind of ethics for being. Because what happens if they don't? Their life sucks. They're in pain all the time. They're in discomfort all the time. They're hungry all the time. They're experiencing these traumas, these technical philosophical definition punishers are always existent, and then you're just falling prey to them, right? I tell my students all the time, the question is not how to live your life avoiding a consequence. There's always, every single decision that we make has a consequence. The question rather is it going to be a good consequence or a negative consequence, right? So, and this is where Aristotle gets pretty brilliant here when he tries to define what is a just or virtuous or good behavior, is doing the right thing at the right time with the right people in the right situation for the right purpose ad infinitum, right? Essentially, he says that it's context dependent for the panoply of inputs that you have for that system, right? Your understanding of your sensory inputs coupled with your understanding of how you fit in the community, coupled with your understanding of how you're trying to do this thing to help this person out, blah, 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 right? And it goes on forever. And that's particularly witty for me because people want an answer. Right? There's a lot of times that most people on the planet, if you just tell them what to do, they'll more or less do it. And here he is wrestling for hundreds of pages with how to live a good life and why you should live a good life. And his answer is, well, how to live the good life is doing the right thing in the right way at the right time with the right intentions and the right blah, blah, blah. And he doesn't ever define what right is because it changes.
Right. The words like stereotype and prejudice are very emotionally charged words because they have been taken from psychology and used in popular culture in specific ways. And they do mean the things that they're talking about, like prejudice can be bad, stereotypes can be bad, but they are facts of life that we study in psychology. And just wanted to clarify that because the same with punishment, like these words all have negative meanings, but really they have a scientific meaning. And that's what we're trying to talk about here. But like having a stereotype of like the way a person is dressed, a person's age, a person's race can help you contextualize where they are and what they're doing in that moment. Like in my neighborhood's really close to a school, and I constantly see gaggles of children walking unsupervised, like to school or from the school bus or just on a field trip. I'm like, why are all these kids going around? And I always look, like, do they have a backpack? Do they have shoes on? Do they look like they're a lost child, or do they look like they're part of the school? They're going to the school bus, based on the way that they dress and the way that they're walking and what they're carrying with them. Because if I saw a kid who didn't have a jacket and didn't have shoes on or a backpack walking around, I'd probably stop them and ask them, are you lost? Otherwise, I'll just let them go on. And that is a prejudice and a stereotype, the stereotype of what a kid going to school looks like, and a prejudice of, well, I guess, prejudice of like kids being lost is bad and I should help them. So that's probably not the right use of prejudice, but you know what I mean? Like my opinions on that person being there in that situation as right or wrong, or something that needs fixed, or I need to tell them to leave, or I need to help them get their parent XYZ. And having it's like you have to teach that to someone explicitly. At some point, we all were told, like, a lost child needs help. None of us can probably remember when we learned that, or why we learned that, or who taught us, or in what words, but it's something that you just absorb over time, which goes into the right cascade that you need. Because I guess it is based on the consequences. Like, a lost child will be scared and could possibly be hurt by someone with bad intentions, and I, with good intentions, should step in and help them. That kind of, I think that's the end of my thought.
Yes. A lot of different ways I can go with this. I like how you snuck in humankind's negativity bias into that. Mm-hmm. Right. Lost child might get hurt by somebody bad, when we generally tend to operate with the presumption that if I assume you have at least not malicious intentions, then you can assume that I have at least not malicious intentions. So not to downplay it, because it is a serious issue and these things do happen and they need to be prevented at all costs, but looking per capita, per country, and for our global population, there really aren't as many sadistic kidnappers as we act like, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of because we are wired to have that negativity bias, which de-incentivizes and creates that ethic to go with it, that those behaviors are bad. Or something else I was going to say too. Oh, about the prejudices, biases, stereotypes, whatever. Open the thesaurus and scroll down through synonyms. They all apply. Yeah. Obviously, there are those people that use those to make quality of people decisions, and doing so has detrimental effects. I would argue because they are falling under an essentialism fallacy. They're using their limited understanding of their limited stereotypes and prejudices to essentialize somebody else and to make them fit neatly into that category that they can dispense with. At the same time, they're also necessary. And to complicate your example about the school children thing, what you're doing when you're using these heuristics is you're taking that infinite possibility space and you're narrowing it down to a comprehensible depth. or rather you're shallowing it to a more comprehensible depth, so that way you can deliberately interact with whatever event or experience you're participating in, right? If we don't, then, I mean, that's why we only see so much of the visible light spectrum. That's why we only have an audio range of so much, because you could literally have an infinite amount of sensory inputs. And what do you do with that much information? You shut down. If I have too many tabs open on my computer, if I'm trying to have my computer do too many tasks at the same time, it overheats and the thing shuts down. Same thing happens with the brain. You throw too much stuff at it. You throw too much spaghetti at the wall to see how much is going to stick. Like if you throw a bowl of spaghetti bigger than my house, it's all going to stick. And how do you make sense of that, right? That sensory overload. And that seizure is synonymous with the computer crashing. Your brain just goes and then you stop.
I think it's also more ethical to use those stereotypes than it would be to ignore them and treat everything as a novel situation. Like, it would be wrong for me to ask all the children who go past my house, are you going to school? Are you safe? Are you okay? That would be weird. Like, that would be like neighborhood watch weird, and would be a red flag behavior from me. Like asking every kid who walks by, where are you going? Are you okay? Are you safe? Like it would come from a nice place, but it would be very strange. And so for me to rely on my stereotype, kid looks like he's going to school, I'm just going to assume he's going to school and he doesn't need my heroism at the moment. And that would make everyone more comfortable and would put the kid at less risk from talking to random strange adults on the side of the road, or setting some type of precedent that like it's okay for other people to talk to, children that aren't theirs on the random side of the road when they're obviously just trying to get to school. It's probably better to use them than it would be to just ignore them.
And on top of that, too, we have to think return on investment in time principles.
Oh, yeah.
We simply just don't have the time in the day to every single instance of meeting somebody, regardless of whether we know them or not, to start that process of sitting down with them and establishing how to interact with you from a philosophical first principles every single time.
Right.
It just
saves time. It's time saver.
It's not practicable, right? If I had to go through the checkout line at my local grocery store, and every single time the cashier and I have to agree that we're in the same,
the customer,
right, agree that we're the same place, that we're in the same place, agree upon the roles that we're enacting in that instance and experience, agree that the thing that I'm purchasing is what I'm purchasing, agree that purchasing is an action that I can do, that my currency is a currency. So it's not functional, it's not feasible. We have to have ways to streamline that process within reason.
That's kind of a great segue into the decision-making model outline that I have, because the goal of these is to, like, when you're training to be board certified or whatever nurses do to pass their board to become the profession that you want to be, you learn all of the ethics, you learn the ethics code front to back, and then the idea is that when something happens, you can quickly make a decision that is the correct decision based on these specific things. So it's like a heuristic. It is a heuristic, not like a heuristic, I guess. But the first one we already talked about, which was having an ethical radar, which is very vague, frustratingly vague. What does that mean? And then the next one is like a little detour. It says urgent detour, legal or reporting issue that needs to be addressed immediately. And 29% of the decision-making models have that caveat where, don't continue going through this very long list of decisions you should make and things that you should factor in if this is something that, you need to call 911 or CPS about immediately and, lock the door and not let the kid leave or stuff like that, which is probably good to have in there just in case. Then the third thing on the list is to specify the issue, which I think is interesting because it's sort of saying like, trust your gut, like something feels off, and then deciding what that is as the second step, which to me feels a little backwards. Like to me, I would look at the issue and then decide if it feels right or wrong. But I kind of see why they flip it, because we just talked about how you can't have a clear list of things that are right and things that are wrong. You just have to trust your gut and then go based off of that. And 53% of the ethics articles had that in there. Then let's see if there's an interesting one to skip to, because this is a long list.
And while you scan, I think it's important to point out too that at least with the radar, but I think for all of them, they tend to generalize social deviancy. Right. That which is, and I mean, that might be why you get that caveat or the disclaimer immediately after the ethical radar, because if you have even a poorly tuned ethical radar, you still have a left limit, right limit boundaries for socially acceptable behavior, quote unquote. And mild deviations of that will lead you down further steps in your taxonomy, I guess we'll call it that. Too wide or too extreme of deviations is that whole, whoa, wait, stop, lock the door, we have suicidal ideation or suicidality or homicidality or something like that rearing its head. And this is going to require a separate course of action than merely taking those mild deviations and, hey, buddy, it's probably not a good idea to hit your head against the wall over and over and over and over. Or, hey, buddy, it's probably not a good idea to throw rocks at people on the playground because X, Y, and Z. And we can get into what those X, Y, and Z are in a little bit.
Yeah, for me, that's a very important caveat, because I was trained that, like, if something actually bad happens, you want the investigation to be as clean as possible, which means you don't do any investigating yourself, which all of the rest of this list is. So, like, if there's like suspected child abuse case or adult elder abuse, which, I make calls for these type of things. I see them, I hear them, I get told them. And if I, then follow up and I ask more questions, I can really influence if the investigators, like, there's people who are specifically trained to interview children, to interview abuse victims, and I'm not one of those people. Also, it's not my job. So having, to me, I think it's really important, because I know of cases where, someone thought I can handle this myself and they mess it up because they're not trained to do that. And it's tough because that person's heart really is in the right place and they're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to help this person. They're trying to be altruistic, but, like, oh, we'll figure out the suicidal ideation together. That's not your job. Unless it is your job. But usually that's not your job. You can't do that. You have to call 911, because no matter if you feel like that's the wrong thing to do, that's invasive, this person doesn't want me to do that, you have to make it would be more unethical for you to do the wrong thing and not alert the proper authorities than to try and handle it yourself and do it yourself. Because there are things that are ethics, and then there are things that are law.
Which is where it gets, which is where it gets tricky as an educator in a classroom. And I have to toe this very very fine yet firm line. Because I have a lot of students that come to me for non-content things. So 2 things here really quick. I really like that your job is narrow and specified and delineated.
Yeah, you wear every hat there is.
Because teachers aren't. It's a different conversation to be had. We could probably do something about education here in the next couple episodes or whatever. But part of it is because schools aren't schools anymore. We are increasingly becoming community centers plus. And
yeah.
I'm not going to open that bag of worms, but it's a big old bag of worms that we could spend an hour just talking about that. The other thing that I was going to say too is, this is why I tell my students all the time, I can only do so much. I consider myself an armchair psychologist. I'm interested in pursuing a career in counseling and therapy and stuff like that. I have the knowledge and I have the interpersonal skills, hence why students keep coming to me, because they feel comfortable, right? I don't make it weird or anything like that. But I do know my limits, and I know the field's limits, not just education, but the field of clinicians and counseling and therapy and stuff like that too. And very rarely will I offer advice to a student for what they should do. Oftentimes, I just give them another tool to add to their tool set. You're struggling with anxiety? Well, have you done the near, close, far? Have you tried this cognitive technique or this cognitive technique, just to give them something to practice? I had a student that I had her focus on over spring break to bring me back a list of all of the good things that happened, to start trying to rewire that brain out of the negativity pathway into the positivity pathway. But my students also know that there are things that I am obligated to report. I'll still help you. I'll be as involved as you want me to be as I legally can. That's why I'm in the building, because I don't know if you know this or not, but teachers don't get paid great. We're not in there for the paycheck. But, I also tell them too, like, even if I was licensed and certified to do this, to the extent that some of my students need me to, I'm still handicapped because I'm not the go-to person in the building to mobilize the resources that you might need. I'm only an assistant, right? I can help you have a better day. I can be a place for you to come vent. I can be an ear for you to talk to. I can give you some life coaching advice because life is difficult and we all need some kind of mentor. But I can't get you an appointment with somebody off the school campus. I can't mobilize emergency services. I can call 911, but you know what I'm saying, as far as like the additional psychological help and stuff like that. That's not me. That's what we have guidance counselors in the building for. Like, they're the ones in the positions with the contacts and the certifications and everything that they need professional licensure wise to be able to mobilize all of those things, to be able to contact CPS, to be able to open and conduct investigations, and to mobilize the suicide threat response team and all of those things, right? I can't. And well, I mean, to put it simply, I for the students that it applies to, I tell them all the time, or as often as necessary, I should say, that part of the reason I can only do so much is because I might give you a piece of advice that works for me and it backfires for you. And then right. Now where do we both stand? And I say to you, hey, try this, this, and this, because it really just gets my mind right in the morning, and you do it, and then something terrible happens. not only am I legally responsible, I give a shit because I'm morally responsible, and that's something that I'm going to have to carry.
Something I see in the medical field, which gets, I mean, they have a really bad PR problem with doctors. Everyone hates them. It's such a pain in America. You know, they get paid a lot of money, but they're in a lot of debt. And so they just have a lot of stress. And some of them are assholes. But having this jumped in my mind because I've seen a couple people, you know, just like come across my timeline complaining like, well, it happened. My doctor dropped me because my case is too complex and my needs are too high. And that's the ethical thing to do. If someone is coming in, they're making appointments every single week, they have every problem under the sun, they have, you know, they need a team of specialists and they're just going to you, you have to drop them as a patient to protect yourself from being liable for their issues that you know that you don't have the tools to help with. Or, you know, I can't diagnose you. I have to let you go as a patient. And that happens in my field constantly because, you know, the limit for a behavioral difficulty can be the moon, can be death. And I, in my consultation role, in my 18 hours per year I get with a person, I have to say, no, I can't help with that. That's too intense. And that is an ethical decision. It's not altruistic. It hurts that person for me to say, I can't help you. But it's like, you know, would it be better to have my care that isn't enough or no care at all? And the decision has to be no care at all, because if I'm there as a Band-Aid, then no one's going to notice the bleeding. You know what I mean?
Well,
and so that can be a really tough decision.
I think it goes way deeper than just liability, though. Liability is a big part of it, unless we're using liability as the catch-all term for moral culpability as well, too. Because it's not just, if I offer you assistance and it's insufficient, now I'm legally liable. It's also if I offer you assistance and it doesn't work, you are in a worse place.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just the legal liability, although we have that as kind of like a fail-safe that's, let's be honest, medical malpractice is a thing. We're all fallible. We all have bad days, and not to justify or be an apologist for any of the bad physicians or surgeons out there. Just saying that, you know, we have that safety net underneath, because it's also using your Band-Aids thing, if you have cancer and I'm treating your symptoms, that doesn't help you.
Right. As like a chiropractor or something.
Right.
Not an oncologist.
Might alleviate symptoms in the short term, but it doesn't do anything to extend your quality of life in the long term. Right. Mm-hmm. And so instead of spending the time getting treatment to address the cause, which would increase quality of life, potentially, assuming it's treatable, over a longer term, you're spending that time using short-term gratification and not actually addressing the core problem.
Yeah. A lot of times for me, it's like, you know, I don't want to send him back to like the subacute short-term inpatient. And I have to say, like, too bad. Don't then. But, you know, obviously in more professional terms than that. But like, I can't help you. This is like, you know, this is so beyond what I can help with that I have to say no. And giving a lot of reasoning and documentation for why I'm saying no and why what my recommendations actually are. Because most of the time, actually, not most of the time, I think all of the time, the only ethical way to drop someone is to leave them with a referral. Like, here's what you should do. I'm not the right person for this. And the person is making their own decision. Like, I don't think that's right for me. I think that this is right for me. And just a disagreement. which is, again, where that like gray line of ethics comes from. Like, I want the less intense behavioral treatment that you have. It's like, sorry, that's not going to work. And I think the like scrolling through the last two ethical decision-making things was weigh your available options and behaviors and things that you can do, and then rank them based on what would be best, and then choose the best one. Those are like the last three, and 89, 93%, and 78% have those steps, which I think are the most important ones.
Yeah, it also just sounds like decision threshold with extra steps.
Yes. Well, that's
Right.
things, or like for me, I have to literally type these things out and like write them down and go through my list. And I'm supposed to do that for every single intervention I do. I only do them for the ones that I'm kind of on the fence about because I don't have time. It will get repetitive and things that I know are pretty safe for everyone.
And that's what,
you know,
I think that's what I'm getting at with the decision threshold thing. Right. So like that's the technical definition of decision threshold is the point with which we have gathered enough information to make a probabilistically accurate response. And then we can decide on that course of action and implement it. Right. So like if someone throws a baseball at me, I have that limited window with which to decide whether it's going to hit me and I should catch it or dodge it, or whether it's going to go by me and I don't have to enact a behavior in defense. Right. And at some point I will have received as much information as I can to still leave me enough time with which to make a decision on how I'm supposed to respond. And to me, what those last two sound like are that weigh your options, right? Gather as much information as you can with which to make a probabilistically accurate decision, but then also to make a decision. I think it only works on my end. The thumbs up. But, you know, to make a decision, like philosophically speaking, inaction is the proper course in most, if not all, instances, because we never have enough information with which to make a 100% guaranteed accurate decision. So there's always that chance that any decision that we make and any behaviors that we enact are going to be inaccurate for whatever situation that we're in. Also, too, typically making a decision means picking a side in some capacity, and avoiding that is best, if at all possible, for most instances. However, if it is someone's job to, say, design behavioral interventions to help people outside of the bell curve operate more healthily as people inside the bell curve would, not making a decision is probably the least ethical thing that you could do. You could decide to treat or develop a treatment plan or weigh options or, you know, complete a referral to a specialist or a different department, but not doing any of those things helps the patient the least.
You have to call them back, even though you're going to give them bad news. They're calling, you know, I need help. You can't just ignore them. You do have to call them back and say, I can't, which is very tough. I think that's where, again, like a lot of doctors and these fields that like have the egotism, you know, attached as well. Like I can handle this. I was trained. I know what I'm doing. That's something that I personally battle with all the time, which is like, I could get the skills for this. I'm pretty sure I could handle this. And then having to step back outside of myself a little bit and say like, okay, in a perfect world, sure, little miss behavior, you can handle that. But in your current role right now, you have to say, no, I can't, which it can be very tough, but it's something that you have to do and be honest with yourself, and, accept what's going on. And I think, or similarly, one of the ethical dilemmas I saw most recently that I really liked was an example of a ER doctor who was at the bar and was halfway through their second beer, and someone in the bar dropped dead of a heart attack and needed help. And, is anyone a doctor? Call 911. And he decided not to
emergency triple
help this
bypass.
person. Yeah, he didn't help this person because he was really tired from his shift and he had 2 drinks and he felt drunk, and he was like, I'm not touching that person. The people he was with knew he was a doctor, and he was like, I'm not helping. I've had 2 beers. And it was, something that is really kind of fun to argue. 911 was coming. It was going to be fine. Give him 30 minutes. I don't know why, exactly what happened to the person or what, but obviously he could have helped. He's probably pretty good at CPR. He's a doctor, but he decided not to. And that was the most ethical choice for him, was to leave this person on the floor without help while, obviously people were helping. They were calling 911, but they aren't ER doctors. So, again, the inaction, saying no versus helping a little bit while you're a little drunk, he weighed the risk and said it wasn't worth the risk. And his ethics board would back him up every time on that, because doing something puts you at risk in that situation, and the person at risk as well. Probably not that bad a risk. This, I was probably being a little overly cautious. Didn't have that much to drink, but you know what I mean. That's my opinion.
No, but still, I think erring on the side of caution is always, you know what, I'm going to stick with that. Only Siths deal with absolutes, but I'm going to say erring on the side of caution is always a good move. But still, it's interesting because, and I think we can hit this last point and then we can kind of tie it up. And if we want to do a part 2, we can do a part 2. Something you said there, that you have to call them back, even if it's to say no. And sometimes it's tough, but you can't avoid it. And I think that's the implicit point that we've kind of been dancing around this whole time. Why is it tough? Right? On the one hand, at least let's use a parent-child example again. Tough love is called tough love because it's not necessarily pleasant for the child to go through, because it's a learning moment for them to try and discipline them externally so they can develop a form of internal discipline in order to healthily and appropriately navigate the world and reality, and then therefore be successful however we want to define that. But, I mean, it's the old phrase, this hurts me more than it hurts you. Why? Why are we wired in such a way to have those responses, those negative affective responses, to, even if it's someone we don't know? You get an anonymous phone call from somebody requesting to try and be one of your clients or patients that has behavioral disorder X, Y, and Z, or at least symptoms of such. I'm not going to assume that they've been diagnosed yet, or that diagnoses are accurate. It's outside of my realm of expertise, but they exhibit symptoms of behavioral disorder X, Y, and Z, which are outside of your purview. And so you've never seen this person face to face before. Thumbs up. You barely know their name, but yet it still has that extreme negative connotation to do what you know to be the right thing.
That's interesting, because by the time I'm done with my ethics little backflips that I have to do, my pros and cons lists and my risk benefit analysis, I feel incredibly secure in saying no. And by that point, I am very confident and I know what I'm going to, I feel really good about it by that point. When I'm starting to feel like, ooh, that's when the decision-making process for me starts. And by the time I'm done, I feel good either way. I'm like, okay, I have a plan. I know what the treatment's going to be. I know what I'm going to recommend. And I've got, these sources to back me up. Or on the flip side, by the time I'm done, I feel pretty good about it. And I have these sources to back me up. And, these OARs, all of these fancy numbers, things that I have to go and ask my bosses about every single time to back me up as well. And only when, if I called them and said no, still feeling kind of I would say I'm not done yet making my decisions. I haven't weighed everything yet. I'm not sure, and I wouldn't do it. I don't know what I would do if I was at the point where I'm done and I have to say no, but I still don't feel really good about it. Because I think if I didn't feel good about it, then that meant there's something else I need to consider and I should probably say yes. And if that doesn't feel good, you know what I mean? So I only feel that when I'm coming up to the decision, and then by the time I'm done, I feel completely fine with where I'm at.
Which is
because of these very strict things that I have to follow. For me, it helps a lot.
Fair, I think, to rephrase or to narrow my point a little bit more. Sam Harris, psychologist, has a book. It's called The Moral Landscape, and in it, was part of the New Atheist movement, and he tried to find a naturalistic morality, because that's what a lot of people lean on religion for, is it gives you that moral compass, that moral radar, so to speak. It is a compilation of our culture's experiments in what is right and what is wrong, and what has worked and what hasn't worked, that's been handed down to us through inheritance, right? And his definition for being moral is reducing human estrangement and increasing human flourishing. And the example that he uses is, if we take the metaphor of hell and make it a reality, then hell is that spot in reality where the least amount of human flourishing is possible. And therefore, by definition, its polar opposite would be heaven, which would be that which maximizes human flourishing. And I'm with it to a degree. Where I get caught up, and it might be because I'm just a layperson and I'm overthinking it without the expertise in order to actually think about it properly. But it seems to me that implicit in that statement is that we should, for some unknown reason, want to increase human flourishing. Mm-hmm. And that mysterious reason is what I keep coming back to and I keep getting focused on, right? It's not implicitly inherent or an axiomatic assumption a priori that we should not harm other people. If we're using just a strictly might makes right ethic, then if harming other people gives me a benefit and I'm capable of doing that, then there's nothing inherently wrong with that, so to speak, right? If I am capable of stealing something from somebody else and they can't stop me, it's not, what's the term I'm looking for? it is not intrinsically apparent that that should be wrong. But yet we all kind of have that sense that it is. That's that I don't know if it's a metaphysical jump, but that's that jump that I struggle with the purely naturalistic moralities, unless we become so reductionistic to say that which promotes the evolutionary process is the most just or moral, in which case we're back to Spencer's social Darwinism, where we shouldn't help the poor and the weak because they're a burden on society, and the fit need to survive in order for our species to thrive at its highest. Right now we start getting into eugenics, we start getting into the final solution, all of those things. Right, so somewhere along the line there's this paradigm jump that happens no matter how we try to quantify or qualify ethics, that takes us from here is how things work to here is why we should go along with why or how things are working, or further that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's like there's or to me, my immediate thought is that there's something that tells us that suffering is contagious, and getting rid of suffering will stop it from getting onto us, which I think is true. If there's someone in your neighborhood who's infested with termites or something and they have to move out and their house falls down, that literally probably is contagious to your house. It's going to reach you. And so you would help them and, try and exterminate them. And that's, a very explicit example of when someone needs help and you help them, how it can benefit you. But there probably is something, like, I would wonder, like, what math or what research there is on being in the proximity of someone suffering, what type of contagious, affect that has on you. Usually, if you're in the room with someone crying, it can make you tear up. At a funeral, when the 8-year-old in the front row starts crying, it gets everybody. It's contagious. And so I imagine there's some type of element, some type of measurable element there with seeing someone in trouble, seeing someone suffering makes you suffer as well. And so you would stop their suffering as a result, stopping your own with, it relieves you of that discomfort of being around someone who's having a hard time, struggling. And that's why, you stop and ask the kid, are you lost? Are you okay? Because you would think about that for the rest of the day. Like, oh my gosh, was that kid in trouble? It was, is he suffering? Is he getting murdered right now because I didn't say anything? Are his parents freaking out? Is this going to be on the news? And I imagine that there's that element. I'm wondering what research is out there.
Yeah, I'm certain that there's a correlation with something because we do these things, right? We have the behaviors and thoughts that align with having these concerns when it would be very easy to rationalize not needing them, right? The ancient Athenians in the Melian dialogues by either Thucydides or Herodotus, I always get them mixed up. I'm not as well versed in my ancient Greek as I need to be, apparently. But the whole point is Athens was trying to take over a colony in Milia, and the Melians tried to have a conference with them. Hey, why are you doing this? And the Athenians basically just said, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. Right. And that is that one of the oldest, at least in the Western tradition, ethical points that we can look to and be like, that's where might makes right comes from.
Mm-hmm.
But it's curious to me, though, because I am not entirely convinced that the reductionist materialists are fully correct. It's not the term I'm looking for, but I'm going to leave it. It'll be my dangling participle there. Partly because, A, we know that reality is non-computational. And by that, I mean there is no algorithm for how it works. Richard Dawkins proved this when he had that non-sequential, non-repeating pattern across a 2D plane that it would extend to infinity with only like 2 or 3 different amoebic-shaped puzzle pieces, right? I mean, hell, Happy Pi Day, pi is a number that is not rational. It's non-computational. It's not algorithmic because theoretically it extends in a non-repeating, non-sequential pattern forever, which means there is no deterministic formula with which to chart that, right? What that means is all of the reductionist, materialist scientific theories are by definition incomplete in some kind of way. That's Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Not using this as a whole, there's something like the God in the gaps type of thing. I'm not quite going that far. Just stating that it would be really neat if at some point we could mathematically chart these instances where philosophy struggles the most and find that they coordinate or collate with the areas that are the most non-computational. Right? Well, I mean, it's the is-ought problem. How do we derive an ought from an is? How do we take a scientific theory or a formula or something that explains how the universe works and use it to try and understand why the universe works? Right?
It's right where behaviorism bumps up into mentalism, because the language that you are taught all throughout your schooling is extremely specific. Like, you can't say he slaps people. You have to say he uses an open hand, his right hand extending from his body with force that could be heard from 5 feet away. And then going into your ethics class and hearing, trust your gut. It's such a backflip from what we're trying to do as a science and what we have to do as humans working in a profession with other humans.
Right. And I mean, just that trust your gut example in and of itself is fantastic, because like, what does that mean? We don't know, but we know,
yeah.
And to put other words to that phrase would be to dilute and probably take away the efficiency of that phrase, because we all know it's a synonym for you have instincts, and for whatever reason that we haven't quite figured out yet, your instincts are going to align you with certain things if you just listen to them, and so you can. I mean, it's like,
I think it's the thing that leaves room, sort of the implicit, we will make judgments of you by this, not like you will be judged, which your actions will not be taken objectively. They will be taken subjectively, and preparing you for those times when the, exact to the letter thing that you did factually in reality is plucked out and then put into the world of right and wrong and gray and the things that we were just talking about. And I think having to deal with that in science in general is tough for scientists, because it's just the part that you can't put your finger on and say, well, I did the formula to make aspirin, and I made the aspirin and it came out exactly how I want it. And everyone says, great. And then you stole it. So I'm judging you now. You're not just getting a letter grade based on a rubric, which is, that's why it's so important, is because it leaves that gray room for society to take maintain malleability and be able to change, and suddenly say, actually, guillotines are really wrong. We shouldn't do that. That's crazy. Can't believe we ever did that. Oh my gosh, guys, right? Even though the last one was in 1970 or in the 1970s.
Well, it's almost like metaphysical environmental response. Right.
Yeah.
Where
if you couldn't write it down, because that would defeat the point. It has to be vague enough for us to change and weed people out who are technically following the rules, but that's unethical.
No, but probably like Darwin's theory of evolution with biological and objective reality, there's probably scientific principles that describe the phenomenon at large, right? Where changes in the biological environment trigger genetic mutations that are either successful or not. I'm not saying it triggers, but the genetic mutations happen, and in response to environmental pressures, the ones that are more successful tend to succeed. Similarly, as our metaphysical landscape changes, having semi-permeable / semi-rigid boundaries allows us to adapt to those metaphysical pressures as they change along with our environment. It's
Indeed.
neat. You good?
I am quite captured by the idea of, is suffering contagious on a scientific level, and ready to move on from ethics into something else.